A very good morning to you all. We've just heard from a number of young people who used their voices to remind us that some of the world's greatest challenges can potentially be addressed through the use of science and technology. So 3 words to carve in stone here are technology, innovation, and collaboration, whether it's to do with climate action, poverty eradication, or building peace and security. And here at the SnT conference, we all, every single one of us, get to be a part of that. So I'd like to very warmly welcome you to this session, the 7th edition of the CTBT Science and Technology Conference. Now, my name is Sanam Shantyaei. I'm a senior journalist at France 24. I embarked on my career 15 years ago, and as some of you, certainly friends of the CTBTO, already know, I have been covering the Iran nuclear file for 15 years now. I was in this very city when that historic accord, which was hailed a great victory for the culture of non-proliferation, was clinched just 2 days before my birthday in 2015. And sadly, I haven't stopped following the story as that very historic agreement has been unraveling. And certainly the drums of war continue to beat louder and louder between Tehran and Washington. So as I often say to Dr. Lassina Zerbo, this is a cause, the CTBT is a cause that's very close to my heart, both professionally and personally, because I'm British Iranian. So a heartfelt thank you for allowing me to be a part of this important discussion today. Now, this time around, you may notice that there are some differences to the program. This is the first time that we are using the Festsaal, which certainly enchants with its historic ambience here. We'll be here for the high-level opening. There'll also be a number of scientific sessions which will be taking place in this hall during the week. And the reason for this move is because at the CTBTO, we always strive to be bigger and better, and this year is indeed no different. Now, this year, we are also introducing an app, the SnT 2019, and I would like to invite you to use it because you can keep abreast of all the changes to the program. You can also use a function, the Q&A, to pose any questions that you want to the panels and also reach out, send messages to the participants. Now, as for the panels, there will be one in French later on, so assurez-vous de ne pas le manquer. There'll also be one in Spanish. Todos los hispanohablantes son bienvenidos. Lastly, we have another first this year, and that's the evening sessions, starting with tonight's, and I really invite every single one of you to go to that. It's one called Women in the Science panel, and it'll be followed by a drinks reception if we can tempt you with a few of those. Likewise, tomorrow evening's panel will be on the future of non-proliferation and disarmament, and we'll be featuring refreshments beforehand. Now, this morning we have a number of distinguished speakers who will be sharing their own unique perspectives on science and technology, and on the value of the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty's science-based verification regime. We'll also have an interactive, and we have to make sure it's interactive. We will be taking questions from those of you in the audience. You can also use the app to reach out to us, and this is something that I'll be moderating myself. It's called CTBT, Science and Technology in a Changing World. And this conference, as always, is being live streamed on the website, ctbto.org. So I'd like to welcome our remote participants. Of course, this conference is social, as always. Please do use the hashtag SnT2019 to share your thoughts with us. And you can look out for our art exhibit, Race for Ratification. It's featuring a race car theme, and it very cleverly actually includes a floor space listing the countries on the track to ratifying the CTBT. Also make sure you check out the actual racetrack. You can find all the locations on the venue map that's currently in your program. And now, I would like to invite the man himself, Dr. Lassina Zerbo, the Executive Secretary of the CTBTO, for his opening address. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Sanam. Good morning to everyone. President Fischer, Minister Roskala, Honorable Vice Ministers, my brother Ismail Bashir Ouedraogo, Minister of Energy of Burkina Faso, and many friends from Burkina Faso who join us to support the CTBT today. Rector Polanco is the first woman rector, president of the University of Santo Domingo in 500 years. Thank you for coming. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear predecessors, Ambassador Hoffman, who hired me to the CTBT, Tibor Tot, to whom I succeeded, welcome. And Evelyn, thank you for being here. When I say Evelyn, Evelyn is my best half, so thank you for being here. So it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to the CTBT Science and Technology Conference 2019, the 7th edition in our SnT series of conferences. This year, as in previous years, we have brought together scientists, industry leaders, policymakers, civil society, and academia from around the world to exchange knowledge and share advances in the monitoring and verification technologies relevant to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Science and Technology 2019 is the biggest ever. Participant figures are still being compiled, but so far it looks like we have achieved in excess of 1,700 registered participants. That is one reason why we have moved this opening ceremony and a number of panel discussions here to the Festsaal, which I'm sure you'll agree looks amazing today. Thanks to the designers who have been behind this wonderful setting, but also to the many dedicated staff of the CTBTO. As you can see from the conference program, there is a lot in store this week, with panel, session, and special event covering the nexus to CTBT science, technology, and policy. These are spread across 5 themes: the Earth as a complex system, events and nuclear test site, verification, technology and technique application, performance optimization, and the CTBT in a global context. I will mention some of the innovation in this year's conference in a few moments. But first, I wish to acknowledge some of the most important people in ensuring the flow of CTBT data over the years. The operators of our international monitoring system stations and their staff, with hundreds of stations across the globe, and often in fairly inaccessible locations. These people are the backbone of nuclear test monitoring and detection. Without them, there would be simply no international monitoring system. We are joined today by the caretaker of one such station, Ms. Sani Makila Vesa. Sani is 81, and Sani looked after primary seismic station 17, array in Sysmä, Finland, one of the 50 primary seismic stations in our network. PS17 is located in the middle of a dense forest, quite a distance from Helsinki, where the station operator, the Institute of Seismology at the University of Helsinki, is based. Sani is far too modest to admit how important she is. But this is a signal from our otherwise unnamed station cuts out. It is her No, if the signal from our otherwise unnamed station cuts off, it is her and people like her who take direct action to bring it back online. I visited PS17 a few years ago and then saw the great job that Sunny is doing. I'm delighted that she and her daughter could be with us today. Thank you for all you have done and continue to do to make the world a more peaceful, more secure place. I will invite all participants to give a big round of applause to Sunny and all the unsung heroes of the international monitoring system. Thank you, Sunny, for being here. I also want to thank all the permanent representatives to the CTBTO, past and present, for their dedication. A number here today will soon see their current posting come to an end. Ambassador Shin of the Republic of Korea has just left Vienna for fresh challenges, but his tireless work will not be forgotten. And I'm certain his designated successor, Ambassador Dato Ganeson, will take the ball and run with it. Now, when I talk about permanent representative, of course, I cannot be citing all of you who will be leaving, but I want to acknowledge few that I've seen and that will go probably in the next few days. And Merav, who has been here 6 years and been a tireless participant to the CTBTO. I think Merav has been one of the most present in all our technical and non-technical meetings of the CTBT. She will be leaving soon. Thank you, Merav, for having been such a great support to the CTBT. Now, looking more closely at the program, you will notice many exciting elements that appear for the first time. For this, I want to recognize the blue sky thinking and hard work put in by the two project executives of this year, Tammy Taylor, Director of the International Data Center, and Nurjan Merav Ozel, Director of the International Monitoring System. Together with a team from across the whole organization and the two project managers, Martin Kalinowski and Jim Matila, and many, Cormac, and I can't cite them all, they have added a fresh touch to the SnT 219. Youth engagement was introduced as an essential element at the last conference in 2017, and this year it is more strongly integrated than ever. This afternoon's Youth Forum, held jointly with the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, will put young people up front and center as they tell us what needs to be done to achieve peace and security. Two panel discussions today will be held entirely in French, as mentioned by Sanam, and Spanish languages. This is in keeping with our determination to walk the talk on multilingualism in our organization. And tonight, we will have our first ever evening session, called at the Munich Security Conference the Nightcap Session, a lively panel on women in science and technology, which will be followed by a reception. A further evening session will be held tomorrow on getting the non-proliferation and disarmament architecture back on track, just after the reception sponsored by the European Union. And I hope so many of you will be there. Ladies and gentlemen, the high-level opening this morning features eminent speakers and discussants. There is a strong host country presence. We are honored to have Minister Iris Raškola, Austrian Federal Minister of Education, Science and Research, present to deliver words of welcome. Austria has always been a firm friend of the CTBT and of this series of conferences. Thank you, Minister Raškola, for being here. Our first keynote address today comes from a man who is no stranger to most, former President of Austria, Dr. Ernst Fischer. Thank you, Dr. Fischer, for being here. As you will have seen on our program, the announced keynote speaker was the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. Due to the sad passing of Mr. Ban's mother a few days ago, is unable to be in Vienna with us. Our thoughts are with him and his family. Together with Ambassador Shin, 2 weeks ago, we were in Seoul when his mother had, I think, a health problem. And he was concerned, and then it happened, the sad news came, and Ban Ki-moon couldn't join us today. Dr. Fisher, who is co-chair of the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, will deliver the address on his behalf, and we are delighted to have him. I also wish to thank Professor Sir Mark Welland, Master of St. Catherine's College, University of Cambridge, for being here to deliver this year's scientific keynote. Sir Mark has a wealth of experience in the application of science to policy making, and we look forward to what will undoubtedly be an interesting and illuminating address. Our high-level panel this morning is titled CTBT, Science and Technology in a Changing World, and will provide a link to many of the themes and issues under consideration during the course of the week. United Nations Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu, will join us today together with Professor Romain Murenzi from the World Academy of Sciences and Professor Jennifer Thomson of the Organization for Women in Science for the Developing World. Between them, there will be a lot to discuss, from how the CTBT can advance nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament and science diplomacy, to how barriers to participation in science can be overcome. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we look at the world today, I understand very well the temptation to give in to cynicism, where nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament is concerned. But the message I want this conference to deliver is that there is good news to share, and we are valuable assets we can build on. Today, there are over 300 international monitoring system installations positioned around the globe, sounding data to the International Data Center in Vienna. In fact, the CTBTO already provides a level of nuclear test detection capability few thought would be possible when the treaty was first negotiated. Over 90% of the CTBT facilities have been built and transmit data, allowing state signatories to draw an independent conclusion on the nature of events picked up by the system, and ultimately determine whether a nuclear explosion has occurred. This corresponds to approximately 14 terabytes of data per year, making the CTBT second to none when it comes to monitoring and better understanding our planet. The strong performance of the verification regime for nuclear test monitoring and other purposes is borne out by the abstracts, posters, and the oral presentation to be made here this week. This demonstrates clearly that the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is not a theoretical treaty. It has a real impact. Let us not be distracted by Let us not be distracted by cynicism. Signatures and ratification continue to accrue. With Zimbabwe ratifying recently, the treaty has now reached 184 state signatories, of which 168 have ratified. Meanwhile, the opening of our new technology support and training center, test center in Cybersdorf, made possible by the generous support of state signatories, shows that the CTBTO organization is here for the long haul. But more needs to be done. Delivering on the CTBT is key to rebuilding the trust needed for the way ahead. Actions on the treaty would provide the progress that we need to see in the run-up to next year's Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. Given that the CTBT verification is up and running and that there is a de facto global moratorium on nuclear tests, entry into force is the most effective disarmament measure within the grasp of the international community. All states have the responsibility to pass on the hard-won gain of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to future generations. The discussion over the next few days will focus on CTBT technologies and their various applications, but we should never forget that this is one part of a bigger prize. The progress that we make on looking in the nuclear test ban on both the scientific and diplomatic fronts will determine how successful we are in reaching out ultimate goal of making the world a more safe, a more secure, and a more prosperous place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zerbo. Now, for those of you like myself that don't live in Vienna, this is a wonderful city. It's known for its art, architecture, music, scientific endeavors, and of course, diplomacy. Vienna has been a nerve center for Europe, the United Nations. It's also home to a number of international organizations like the CTBTO since it was established in 1996, thanks to the Austrian government. And that brings us to the first speaker this morning. That's Dr. Iris Rauskaler, Austria's Minister for Education, Science and Research, who will be delivering some words on behalf of our host country. Minister Rauskaler, the stage is yours.
Dear Executive Secretary, Dr. Zerbo, dear President Fischer, Excellencies, dear Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be present at the Hofburg today and participate at this high opening of the 7th CTBT Science and Technology Conference. It looks as if the success of the previous conference in 2017, with about 1,000 participants, will be outdone this year easily. Congratulations on this. As Austria's Federal Minister of Science, I'm particularly happy to be here, not only representing a member state of the Preparatory Committee and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization and the organization's host state, but also as the representative of a country that fervently supports nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Lately, the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation community has not exactly been spoiled for good news. Nuclear power competition is increasing, established channels of communication are breaking down, investments in the arsenals are on the rise, as are boasts about the development of new, ever more terrible weapons. Even existing disarmament progress is being reversed and is being questioned. We have to fight these disastrous tendencies, and the CTBTO should be at the forefront of this battle for preventing proliferation of nuclear arms. In this context, I may refer somewhat proudly to the new CTBTO Technology Support and Training Center that has been opened in the presence of Austrian and foreign dignitaries in Seibersdorf in the Lower Austria last Wednesday, as Executive Secretary already mentioned. The Austrian government is very pleased indeed that CTBTO has chosen the site next to the Austrian Institute of Technology and Seibersdorf laboratories for this very major infrastructure investment. Today, I believe everyone agrees that we have another reason to celebrate, as this conference gives an outstanding example of CTBTO's efforts to reach out and promote the wider civil and scientific application of techniques and data used for test ban verification. The conference takes place against the background of the enormous achievements of the CTBTO, PrepCom and Provisional Technical Secretariat in having brought the CTBT verification system to a degree of realization of well over 90%, even before the entry into force of the treaty. The data delivered by the system was crucial in ensuring a unified reaction of the international community in condemning North Korea's nuclear tests. And let us not forget the civil scientific benefits that can be derived from the techniques and data used for test ban verification. The efficacy of the international monitoring system has proven key to detect and combat the consequences of natural disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes. On the way forward, it will be necessary to strengthen and the engagement of the scientific communities working in test ban monitoring even more, especially young scientists. Let me quote the Executive Secretary, who states that this conference facilitates the articulation of new ideas and technologies that are essential for promoting global peace and security. Together, we must try to improve continuously nuclear test monitoring and verification. Vienna's Hofburg, it was already mentioned, is among the world's most attractive conference locations. I'm confident that all of you, dear participants, whether you're well-established or still young scientists, industry leaders, media representatives, or policymakers, will find the Hofburg atmosphere and the Vienna spirit beneficial for your lively discussions and scientific deliberations during the next 5 days. In this spirit, I wish this conference and all its sessions numerous beneficial results. May your work be a fruit and help us along a path of continuous progress towards the entry into force of the comprehensive test ban treaty and eventually to reaching our common goal of eliminating the threat of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Rauskaller. Now, moving on from one woman, and this is always an honor, to another, one who made her way from science policy to becoming the EU's top diplomat, a woman who strived, like many others here, to make the CTBT's entry into force actually among the top priorities, amongst others, of the European Union, which for years has been a staunch supporter of the treaty. I am, of course, speaking about Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and the Vice President of the European Commission. She's also a member of the Group of Eminent Persons for the CTBT or GEM. Now, although sadly Federica Mogherini can't be with us here present, she has sent us a video message. Let's take a listen.
but also to assess the impact of climate change. Such progress
Federica Mogherini speaking there. Now, I think this is the perfect moment to mention that tomorrow evening there'll be a special event hosted by the EU to celebrate its cooperation even with the CTBTO. That will be here in the Festsaal at 6:30 p.m., carrying over to a reception in the Hofburg Gallery. Following that reception, we'll have the last of our evening panels on a timely discussion, getting the non-proliferation and disarmament architecture back on track. That will kick off at 7:30 p.m. I do hope you can all make it. Now, as Dr. Zerbo mentioned, originally we had planned to have the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, as our keynote speaker this morning. Unfortunately, his mother did pass away, and I'd like you to join me in wishing him and his family strength during these challenging times. Even if Ban Ki-moon is not present today, I believe that his drive and determination is very much amongst us. Mr. Ban was, of course, the chairperson of the CTBT PrepCom while serving as career ambassador here in Vienna. Later, as Secretary General of the United Nations, he consistently, tirelessly even, advocated the universal ratification of the CTBT. And later this afternoon, as mentioned, the Forum on Global Citizenship and Youth Inclusion, jointly held with the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, will examine just how young people can drive change, how they can contribute to activities focused on building and sustaining peace, including the fields of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Moving on, I'd like to express how honored we are that the former president of Austria, Dr. Heinz Fischer, who's also the co-chair of the Ban Ki-moon Center, has kindly agreed to deliver this morning's address on behalf of Ban Ki-moon. Dr. Fischer, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Dear Lassina Serbo, dear ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you here today in the Vienna Hofburg for this important science and technology conference, which is also a peace conference, as I'm sure. My great friend and colleague, Ban Ki-moon, regrets very much that he cannot be with us today. It was said already that personal circumstances prevented him to come to Vienna and to speak at today's opening ceremony. he asked me to be here in his stead and speak to you about the important role the CTBTO continues to play for a peaceful and secure cohabitation on this planet. Ban Ki-moon, who sends you his very best regards, served as the CTBTO chairman, as it was said already, of its preparatory commission back in 1999. This shows that this organization has been dear to him since the very initial years of its existence. And I will use the draft manuscript of Ban Ki-moon as the basis of this speech, transformed a little bit in my language with some personal remarks from my side. Ladies and gentlemen, the CTBTO remains a shining example of how science and technology can help contribute to positive political and diplomatic outcomes. The treaty has had a significant positive impact since it was adopted in 1996. With the notable exception of North Korea, the CTBT has achieved de facto implementation despite not having entered into force, with no other nuclear state having carried out a nuclear test since 1998, with the exception of North Korea, as I've said already. And despite the lack of entry into force, the CTBT and CTBTO have made important contributions in making it easier to detect nuclear tests and in establishing a strong normative taboo against states carrying out nuclear tests. This has made a notable contribution to protect the world from deeply harmful environmental and health impacts of nuclear testing. This has been possible because of the hard work and commitment of a group of scientists and technology experts who nearly 30 years ago undertook intensive, complex, and sensitive groundwork to pass the way for a deal. Their efforts made it easier for the diplomats to negotiate the final text because there was already a scientific and technological consensus on the parameters. Therefore, all of us express our admiration and gratitude for all this organization has done over the decades to support nuclear non-proliferation and the true cause of peace. But I fear, and we all fear, it is a bittersweet moment because there is just now an acute risk that rash and hubristic policy shifts could undo the valuable work the CTBTO and others have achieved, bringing us closer to the brink of a devastating nuclear war than any time since many decades. We currently find ourselves at one of the most dangerous times for arms control efforts. The bilateral arms control architecture development between the United States and the Soviet Union towards the end of the Cold War is being rapidly unraveled through a combination of neglect, hubris, and erroneous threat analysis. The risk of a catastrophic nuclear event, whether by accident or design, is increased by the paralysis in international bodies charged with upholding peace and security, most notably the United Nations Security Council. Ban Ki-moon had the honor of addressing the Council earlier this month in New York as a member of the Elders, the group of independent leaders founded by Nelson Mandela, whose work for peace, justice, and human rights is known all over the world. Together with Mary Robinson, he spoke frankly and open to the Council, and particularly its 5 permanent members, namely Ban Ki-moon, all nuclear-armed states, to remind them of their unique, heavy responsibility to develop effective processes of non-proliferation and disarmament. But there are only a few, very few signs of the P5 and other states with nuclear weapons capabilities showing willing to react positive, as national and international politics appears increasingly driven by polarization, isolationism, and alarming disdain for the very principles of multilateralism. The imminent expiration of the INF Treaty in August is the most significant blow, with the potential to threaten the stability not only of Europe, but also much of Asia and other parts of the world, if it leads to a renewed arms race involving many countries and many governments. The decision of United States President Donald Trump to withdraw from the INF is symptomatic of a much broader negative context of unilateral moves and repudiation of previous agreements. Consider the possible collapse of the JCPOA, an agreement negotiated so painstakingly here in Vienna, and which was universally deemed to be working well before the American decision, with all the implications we see now for rising tensions between Iran and the United States and the wider Middle East security. Consider as well the recent United States withdrawal from the Arms Trade Treaty and the growing concern as to whether the New START treaty between the United States and Russia will be extended beyond February 2021. Distinguished delegates, the world needs to wake up to the severity of the current threat, and the nuclear states must get serious about taking steps towards disarmament to avert an incalculable catastrophe. Nuclear weapons constitute an existential threat to the future of humanity, just as much as climate change. And just as science plays an indispensable role in the fight against climate change, so it must now be mobilized in the service of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. This includes exact and dispassionate analysis of new technological developments that risk complicating and destabilizing traditional practices of arms control and disarmament, including artificial intelligence, cyber technology, and space-based delivery and tracking systems. In the longer term, total disarmament is likely to require the multilateral agreement of a nuclear weapons convention. This may seem a remote prospect today, but in order for such a convention to be a realistic possibility in the future, there is an important need for substantial work to be done now to find technological solutions that can enable total disarmament to take place with confidence that effective verification and enforcement mechanisms are in place. all of us need to treat these issues with the utmost seriousness and urgency. This is why the elders have launched a new initiative on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, which was presented by Mary Robinson and Lakhdar Brahimi to the Munich Security Conference this February. They are calling on the nuclear powers to pursue a minimization agenda that could help to reduce the nuclear threat and make concrete progress toward disarmament. Nuclear states should and must make progress in 4 areas, namely, first, doctrine, all states making a no first use declaration. Second, de-alerting, taking almost all nuclear weapons off high alert status. Deployment, dramatically reducing the number of weapons actively deployed. And decreased numbers for Russia and the United States to adopt deep cuts in warhead numbers to around 500 each, with no increase in warheads by other states. Distinguished delegates, above all, the nuclear states must work to reduce tensions and take practical, concrete steps to demonstrate the world that they do not intend to keep these weapons indefinitely. In this regard, it would be a tremendously positive step for the nuclear states to make concrete progress towards finally bringing the CTBT into force. Ban Ki-moon is urgently calling upon the 8 remaining Annex II states who have not yet ratified the CTBT, 6 of whom possess nuclear weapons, to do so at the earliest opportunity. There is no good reason to fail to sign or ratify this treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, steps towards disarmament need to be implemented with the understanding that the binary divide of the Cold War, with Washington on the one side and Moscow on the other, is no longer dominant. Instead, we live in a world of interlinked nuclear chains where decisions by one state can have a ripple effect beyond any one immediate strategic environment. The only way to tackle these threats is to internationalize and multilateralize the issue, including via the United Nations and bodies such as the CTBTO. Only by facing these threats together as a global community can we hope to find a durable solution. No country individually, nor the international system collectively, has the capacity to cope with the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. For the very survival of humanity, nuclear weapons must never be used again, and the only guarantee of the non-use of nuclear weapons is their complete abolition. We will only reach this goal if the broad mass of humanity understands the urgent nature of the threat and the political and moral imperative to drastic action to cut the number of warheads and fundamentally reassess strategic defense positions and doctrines. The Ban Ki-moon Center, which was mentioned already, works to empower women and young people to act as global citizens and to contribute to the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Later today, in the afternoon, the Ban Ki-moon Center will co-host the Youth Forum on Global Citizenship and Youth Inclusion. In a lively session, we will focus on the ways how youth can contribute to the achievement of the SDGs as well as to peace and security. The forum will take place in the same hall, and I'm looking forward to seeing many of you today in the afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, the time to act is now. Otherwise, we risk slipping from inertia into irreversible rigor mortis, Totenstarre in German. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very well conference on this important subject. Thank you.
If you just give me a moment, I'm slightly more vertically challenged. I have to put the podium back. I'm not that strong. Thank you very much, Excellency, for that inspiring and important keynote address on behalf of Ban Ki-moon. And as mentioned, we do look forward to hearing more from Dr. Fisher at this afternoon's Youth Forum. And that's not the only youth-centric event this week, a word you'll keep hearing again and again. And the reason for that is because the CTBTO, and this is very important, it strives to give the world's youth a powerful platform to engage in dialogue with decision makers. So as Dr. Zerbo earlier mentioned, young people will be actively participating throughout the week. We'll be taking questions from them. We're also particularly pleased to have so many young scientists this morning, and this leads me to our scientific keynote address. Professor Mark Welland is the Master of St. Catherine's College at the University of Cambridge. And earlier this year, he was appointed Director of the Maxwell Center, a hub for world-leading research in physical sciences and technology. So Mark started his career in nanoscience and nanotechnology at IBM Research Laboratories, went on to establish a purpose-built facility at Cambridge, the Nanoscience Center. Previously, he was Chief Scientific Advisor in the UK Ministry of Defence. That's from 2008 until 2012. Professor Welland, welcome to SnT 2019. Please welcome to the stage.
Dr. Zerbo, ministers, distinguished guests, participants. It's a great pleasure to speak to you today. I've entitled my talk Science, Policy and Diplomacy, and I'm a scientist, so of course I have to have a PowerPoint presentation. You may wonder why I am stood in front of an audience, a CTBTO audience. As just alluded to, from 2008 to 2012, I was plucked from academic life in Cambridge and appointed as Chief Scientific Advisor for Defence and Security at the Ministry of Defence. And amongst the responsibilities, the very significant responsibilities that this role has and had, relevant today are the two top items on this list. So, responsibility for the UK nuclear deterrent and principle of the 1958 Mutual Defence Agreement. The 1958 Mutual Defence Agreement is a very special agreement between the US on the UK on matters nuclear. It covers all sorts of nuclear topics, from nuclear warheads, nuclear delivery systems, through to nuclear terrorism. And it was a privilege to be principal of that agreement for those 4 years. I also had responsibilities for international treaties. So what I wanted to do today was to give you a personal and a scientist's perspective of what CTBT meant to me in those years and how that played out in a very political way over that period. Coming from an academic post and working on very small structures in nanotechnology, to suddenly be confronted with responsibilities as severe as a nuclear weapon took some time to accommodate to, but was a responsibility I took extremely seriously. And the consequence of CTBT for me and my colleagues in defence in the UK was that we had to deploy an incredible array of scientific tools to ensure that the UK nuclear deterrent remained a viable deterrent. So the science of warheads is extreme, and I'll explain why shortly, and diverse. And I like to put this into perspective. There's a picture there of Lewis Hamilton's Formula One car of this season. He won the Grand Prix yesterday. Imagine building that car, filling it with petrol, putting it in a garage, shutting the door, and then 25 years later expecting Lewis Hamilton to jump in and complete a Grand Prix. That's the challenge of ensuring that a warhead in the UK stockpile can deliver if it's ever required to. We pray, of course, it will never be needed. But that's the challenge, is how do we ensure, without testing, that a warhead will be effective. So just to give you the sort of scientific challenges of that, in the top corner there is the primary of a nuclear weapon, and in the center, the blue is the fissile material, and the explosion compresses that material and energy is released. And that energy is released in about a millionth of a second, so on an incredibly short timescale. The temperatures reached in that timescale are hotter than the sun, millions of degrees, and the pressures are enough to compress a block of steel to less than a tenth of its original size. So all of those three very severe scientific restrictions make it incredibly difficult. Measuring physical events on very short timescales is difficult enough. Measuring them at temperatures hotter than the sun is even more difficult. And then measuring them at pressures where some matter which you would at room temperature be solid are liquid or gaseous at pressures that will compress even a block of steel to a fraction of its original size. These are huge scientific challenges, and it means we have to deploy a lot of scientists and a lot of expense in order to ensure that we can conform to our obligations under CTBT. And I want to go through very briefly the elements of what we do to make that guarantee, to make those assurances. The first is the data from past atmospheric and underground tests. And that data is like gold dust. It's hugely valuable and hugely important in understanding, because it's the only data we have of actual nuclear detonations. So that data is protected and pored over in great detail. So that's one part. The second part for the UK is demonstrating that a nuclear warhead can be delivered precisely to a preordained target. The fact that we share a missile system with the US means that there have now been over 100 tests of the D5 missile system, and that allows us to demonstrate to the wider world that we have a viable deterrent, and it also allows us, through instrumentation, to ensure that we can guarantee that delivery system of the warhead. But then comes the science, all those short periods of time, the high pressure, the high temperature. And there are three elements, three very broad elements to that. The first is that we use supercomputers. And when I say we, the UK will do this, the US does this, France certainly does this. We use supercomputers to model what goes on inside a warhead at detonation. And the better we get at producing bigger computers, the better we get at understanding the fundamental science, the better we get at predicting the behavior of warheads in those extreme conditions. So a supercomputer, the investment in supercomputing and the fundamental science that underlies that, including the data from underground tests that gives you something to reference against, is hugely important. The second part is broadly known as plasma physics, and this is where you try and understand the behavior of matter under these incredible pressures, and that is done by focusing a number of large lasers to a tiny point the size of a pin. So that's the physics of materials under enormous energetic bombardment. The third part, called hydrodynamics, is where you detonate a warhead-type device, but not clearly with fissile material, but with a similar material, and you see how it compresses under these enormous pressures. And to see how it compresses, you need to look through that material, and you can do that with X-rays. So you have a system where you focus a beam of X-rays, a very, very, very intense beam of X-rays, through that implosion, through that detonation, at the moment of detonation, so that you can take a snapshot in that tiny fraction of a second during the detonation process and understand the physics of what's going on. The image there is, if you look in the top left, is the sort of cardboard-looking structure hides the device, the simulated device that will be exploded. It's called a bomb chamber. And the two big nozzles that you can see more clearly in the after image are where those X-rays can come in and take an image of what's going on inside. Now, this is what I've just described is an enormously expensive and people-intensive enterprise. It takes years to establish these facilities, years to test them, and years to be sure that the data you're collecting slowly builds up to give you this certainty in the absence of testing. There is a final element, a very important element to this, and that is that if you're a nuclear weapon state like the UK and you have an independent deterrent and you have a sovereign attitude to protecting that deterrent, then unlike in science where everything you do is peer-reviewed, in nuclear science, peer review is, of course, going to be very challenging. And so we rely on trusted relationships with other nuclear weapon states to share in a very careful way our experiments, how we do our experiments, what measurements we might make, and in that way we can cross-correlate with scientific colleagues in other nations. So that's how CTBT looked like to me when I came into that job as a scientist simply trying to support the UK nuclear deterrent. But the political elements of CTBT, the political elements of working with the US and France as trusted partners, always threw up challenges, but it also threw up opportunities. And early in 2010, President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron met and agreed that they would establish a 50-year defense treaty. 50-year defense treaty. At the heart of that treaty was a sharing of our ability to underwrite our nuclear weapons. This is the first time that a nuclear weapon state such as the UK, such as France, any nuclear weapon state, started to seriously think about sharing capabilities in the way that finally materialized. And this is a front copy of the treaty, which you can download online. And what was interesting, there were two interesting elements of this treaty. The first was, although it was a defense treaty and had significant defense elements in it, such as sharing operations, being able to land aircraft on each other's carriers, although that turned out not to be possible. Although there were significant defense elements to it, at its heart and fundamental to both nations was a nuclear treaty. And that fell largely upon me to negotiate. And starting from a position where I had written to a previous Prime Minister at length explaining why we should not do this, I was confronted with a situation where I was told that this was what we needed to do, and we had a timescale to deliver it. So there was an intense period of exchange, backing and forth between London and Paris for me and for my French counterparts, while we negotiated what started out as almost an impossible position. And that position was that the UK would effectively surrender one of those capabilities that I talked about as underwriting the science, the hydrodynamics capability. We would actually stop doing that in the UK, and we would transfer it to a joint facility in France. And that we did. We came to an agreement. It was difficult, but we came to an agreement, and this was the signing of that treaty in London on the 2nd November 2010. The agreement was called, on the nuclear side, was called the Tutatis Treaty. And when I was preparing for this presentation, I had a look on the web to see, because there was a lot of interest in this at the time, and I was curious to find out that there was still interest in this treaty today, for all sorts of reasons. But one of them was speculating as why it was called Tutatis. And in fact, I can tell you for the first time exactly why it was called Tutatis. I went home one day from London, and my French colleague said, "We need to think of a name for this treaty." And I said, "Okay, I'll go and I'll find a name." So I had to find a name that both the UK and France would be content with, and that didn't imply one nation was better than the other, or that one nation had the upper hand. And so I went through all of the deities around in Roman Britain on the basis that Rome had taken over Gaul, as it was called at the time, and Britain, and there were probably common deities. And indeed, there was a deity called Tutatis, and that little picture of the lion comes from the Roman time. So there was a deity called Tutatis who was worshipped both in Gaul and in Britain. And Tutatis was a protector. So I thought that by itself was a good start. But there was another part to this, and that is that I'm a great Asterix fan, or at least I was when I was younger. And so those of you who've read Asterix will know that he has an expression when things get tough, and he says, "By Tutatis." And I thought that was also a fitting element to the name, because it was quite difficult at times to negotiate this agreement. So that's why it's called Tutatis. Nothing very clever. It's just a joint deity that didn't raise, on either side of the channel, any issues. So I've said that in France, this meant establishing a new hydrodynamics testing facility called EPUR. And this has a sovereign part of the UK in the facility. And the idea is that when the UK goes to this facility, as it will do very shortly, it's now complete, virtually complete. When the UK goes, it will take its material, it will do its experiments, and it will do so in a room where all the French scientists are excluded. The data will be collected by the UK and taken back to the UK. When the French do a test, all of UK scientists will be excluded. So this is an extraordinary, it sounds simple, but actually to get to that stage of being able to work in a French facility on the most sensitive, protected topics in that way was a testament to the goodwill between the France and the UK, and the goodwill between the scientists who saw very significant scientific advantage in doing it in this way. We also established a technology development centre in AWE, Atomic Weapons Establishment, in the UK, and that similarly has a French enclave. And I went and visited there last year to have a look, and it was for me, having sort of negotiated this, it was very moving to see a small facility that was France, effectively, inside the most protected environment in the UK. So that was this treaty, this very important treaty, came about because of CTBT. Became about because of our absolute obligations to this treaty. At the same time, of course, we always looked beyond the treaty and looked beyond having nuclear weapons to a situation where multilateral disarmament was possible. And so we embarked with Norway and Vertec on a nuclear warhead dismantlement verification exercise over a number of years. Lord Brown of Ladyton, who was Secretary of State for Defence, who's here today, was a part of that activity, as was I. And what I particularly liked about this activity was that in the end it came down to what appears to be a very simple piece of technology. In the end, we needed to be able to verify whether what was in a box was an active nuclear weapon or not. And we had to do that without being able to interrogate any of the science that was in that box, any of the details, the engineering detail. And in the end, that box that you can see in the bottom there, in the end it had a green light or a red light. And the green light meant there was no fissile material present in the box, and the red light meant there was. And the technology behind getting a red or a green light was significant. But in the end, to make this work in this multilateral disarmament exercise, that's what we had to deliver technically. So I want to finish with one additional curve, and then I will just conclude. We we're all aware, and it's been mentioned already, the global warming. And just recently, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up to 415 parts per million. And I think this is my, I won't say favorite, but I think most impactful graph on climate change. And it shows the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere going back 600,000 years. And you can see there are fluctuations. It goes up and down during ice ages, but it's always stayed below that dotted line, which is the 1950 level. And if you look right at the end on the right-hand side, you can see where it's rocketed up recently. So this is the, as it's now sometimes called, the global emergency that we all collectively face. So what have I learnt in my time of working in government, working on science, and how does that impact going forward, not just CTBTO, but global warming? And I think there are two points. One is that science and technology is fundamental to resolving all these issues, being able to support CTBT, being able to support disarmament, being able to provide potential solutions to climate change in the long term. So that I am very clear on. But I'm also very clear that science and technology can only be effective when taken in a much broader context, where its impact can be properly analysed, properly considered, both at diplomatic, political and cultural levels. And it's not a matter of working out the science and then going out to the politicians and saying, right, we've got the science, now how do we do it? It's about the science and the technology working from day one with the policymakers, with the diplomats, and ensuring that as the science develops, not after it is developed, but as the science develops, it can be used, it can be deployed to its greatest effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Mark Welland. Now, before we move on to the panel discussion, the CTBT Science and Technology, that's in the changing world. Firstly, our Q&A segment is open on the app. Please do pose questions to us. It's very important for us that this panel is interactive. Now, we have a little surprise for you. I was hoping it would be something like Dr. Zerbo coming and singing for us on the stage, but it's not. It is sand painting, which is an intricate display of colors and shapes formed by millions of individual grains. For the Native American Navajo Indians, it was an elaborate healing ritual. It has changed today. It's practiced as a form of art, and it's stunning. And it's my pleasure to introduce the very talented Irina Titova, who has actually been dubbed the Queen of Sand. So without further ado, please welcome her to the stage.
test of the atomic bomb, a shattering overture to a new era in man's history. Awe-stricken scientists watched a column of smoke leap 40,000 feet into the stratosphere. For the future, the choice is peace or total destruction. The atomic age is here.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with us for the last segment of our high-level opening, the panel discussion on CTBT, Science and Technology in a Changing World. Now, the topic was actually chosen to reflect our conference goals, and they include broadening and strengthening engagement in the scientific community, exchanging knowledge and supporting national needs and policy objectives. And I'm very pleased to announce that we have very esteemed, 3 of them panelists, each with their own very unique perspectives to share with us. And as always, as I've said, I want this debate to be as interactive and as lively as possible. So I'm expecting questions from the floor, questions on the app that I mentioned, SnT 2019, after the panelists have spoken. Now, we'll be connecting also to some very young voices, the voices of our future. There goes that word again, young people. That's from the outside venue. They'll be putting their questions to the panel. For now, I'd like to start by welcoming our panelists one by one and to hear their take on the following issues. One of them is securing nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. The other is increasing access to science and science careers in a developing world and among women, a topic that's, of course, immensely important. Now, before I proceed, I'd like to take a moment to draw attention to something that I've always really admired about the CTBTO. The fact that today you won't be listening to an all-male panel, what I refer to as a manel. It's really wonderful to see this kind of inclusivity and diversity, but it's really important to remember that this is still not the norm. Women remain largely underrepresented in key forums. So a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Zerberg, Cormac, who's been helping me with this event, and all our colleagues at the CTBTO. So a round of applause for that, thank you. Now, I'd like to get started. I'd like to firstly welcome Izumi Nakamitsu, who has copious amounts of experience both within and outside the United Nations. She has been the UN Undersecretary General and High Representative for the Disarmament Affairs since May 2017. Prior to taking on this post, Ms. Nakamitsu served as Assistant Administrator of the Crisis Response Unit at the UN Development Programme. Now, between 2005 and 2008, she was Professor of International Relations at Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, and earlier in her career, Ms. Nakamitsu was a member of the United Nations reform team of former Secretary General Kofi Annan. And frankly, that list goes on and we could be here all day. It's a very impressive resume. Ms. Nakamitsu will now join us to share with us her views on CTBT Science and Technology for Peace and Security and reflect, this is immensely important today, on the future of the nuclear test ban in this very challenging environment where some key players, we will be speaking about this later, the Americans amongst them, are actively working to undermine the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. High Representative Nakamitsu, please, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you so much for that exceedingly kind introduction, I should say. His Excellency Mr. Lassina Zelbo, Executive Secretary of the CTBT, or I should say my dear friends, and those very prominent amongst the audience, my former boss, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would obviously like to start by thanking the CTBTO for the invitation to speak today. The world is witnessing a technological revolution through which an unparalleled convergence in science and technological innovations are changing almost every aspect of our lives. Communications, logistics, manufacturing, and yes, unfortunately, war and peacemaking have all been and will continue to be revolutionized in our lifetimes. It is, of course, critical to ensure that the ramifications of revolutionary developments are understood, that unintended vulnerabilities are addressed, and that science and technologies are used in ways that benefit humankind in accordance with international law and, of course, the United Nations Charter. In my role as High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, I am often required to call for action to mitigate potentially negative consequences of technological innovation. These include addressing concerns about lethal autonomous weapon systems, ensuring outer space remains the domain of peace and development, and creating, of course, a cyberspace that are both stable and secure. As an international community, we spend much time focusing on potentially negative consequences of science and technology. But what we can and should be also doing is to increase our efforts to highlight and maximize the benefits of science and technology for international peace and security, particularly in the realm of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. For that reason, I very much welcome the CTBTO's initiative in organizing this annual event. The CTBTO is also a leader when it comes to using technology in our field. With the vast amounts of data it continually processes, the International Monitoring Systems, or IMS, is a prime example of the application of advanced data processing techniques. I applaud the CTBTO for having taken the initiative to implement software that uses the state-of-the-art machine learning and artificial intelligence to complement the established analysis tools. The use of machine learning and artificial intelligence increases the quality of data and analysis provided to states. This, in turn, strengthens confidence in the IMS and the nuclear non-proliferation regime more generally. This forward-leaning approach to the latest technological advances should be replicated across the entire disarmament and non-proliferation spectrum. In harnessing the benefits of science and technology, we may find answers to problems that had hitherto been considered unresolvable. One area that is a prime candidate in this respect is nuclear disarmament verification. At the recent Group of Governmental Experts, or GGE, on nuclear disarmament verification, a number of experts mentioned the identification of applicable technologies as one area requiring further attention. This is an area in which science and technology can help reduce uncertainty and build confidence between states, thus enabling progress towards disarmament. How machine learning, data capture and analysis, sensor technology, distributed ledger technology, and secure communications can enhance verification should be explored. I have been particularly struck by how academics and think tanks have been able to contribute to discussions related to nuclear weapons by drawing conclusions from commercially available space-based imaging or geolocation of official photographies and social media and crowdsourcing. Such innovative, independent verification contributions by non-governmental actors would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. As far as we have come, more work remains to be done in this regard. Science and technology have the potential to make great contributions to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, as important as it is to carefully consider and take steps to mitigate the negative consequences of technological advancements. It is also incumbent on us to exploit such advances to strengthen the existing non-proliferation regime and to enable progress towards disarmament. This conference brings together academics, practitioners, diplomats, and international civil servants in a forum that promotes multi-stakeholder dialogue. In this field, perhaps more than any other, it is essential to look beyond our own silos, if you will, and I hope it can be repeated in other disarmament and non-proliferation fora. During the recent public launch of the report of the High Level on Digital Cooperation, Secretary General Guterres talked about the importance of more inclusive multilateralism in the 21st century, where our policy discussions will be able to benefit from perspectives of diverse stakeholders. Innovation, creativity, and dynamism are born in energetic discussions, interactive discussions, such as the one you have been having at this conference. And I'm very much looking forward to the interesting discussions this week. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that insightful address. Now, Professor Romain Murenzi is the Executive Director of the World Academy of Sciences, that's TWAS, based in Trieste in Italy, a city which, in his own words, has become the international capital of science. Now, Dr. Murenzi has over 3 decades of experience in capacity building in science, science policy and diplomacy, in both the public sector and, of course, academia. Previously, he served as Rwanda's Minister of Education, Science and Technology and Scientific Research, and later as Minister in the President's Office in charge of Science, Technology and Scientific Research. Now, amongst other important roles, Professor Murenzi has been a senior scholar at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that's in Washington, D.C., later advising the UN Secretary General on how to support the technology facilitation mechanism for implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to invite Professor Murenzi to share his experience of science diplomacy with us and provide advice on how different countries can make use of this tool to advance policy goals. A side note, thank you for being with us. A side note for you, this topic will be taken up in detail during tomorrow's afternoon panel discussion on science diplomacy. Professor Murenzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellency, President Fischer, Your Excellency, Dr. Lassina Zerbo, Professor Welland, thank you for the inspiring presentation. Good morning. I am sincerely honored to be here today and deeply grateful for the invitation from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Organization to address this promising conference. Dr. Lassina Zerbo, the organization's executive secretary, visited us in Trieste just a couple of days ago and delivered an inspiring lecture on science diplomacy. I know that we share a common vision for science for the Global South and many common values. Dr. Zerbo, many thanks to you and your staff. It is my great hope that we will develop a strong and productive partnership in the times ahead. Change is a constant in human history, and indeed the natural systems of the earth are always changing, but healthy environments and healthy communities maintain an equilibrium, a balance, and even as conditions evolve. Today, I will suggest to you the changes underway are so profound, and they are unfolding so fast that they bring great stress and very real risk of destabilization. We see it in continuing poverty, which is reflected in hunger and worrisome health trends. We see it in the changing climate and in rapidly escalating loss of biodiversity. We see it in the social tension and conflict, and in levels of human migration that are unprecedented since the most difficult days of the World War II. The challenges are shared by both North and South. But because of geography and poverty, and because of the legacies of history, the developing countries are far greater risk. They face more severe challenges, and because they are less resilient, they struggle more. But this North-South divide is not only about poverty, or about resources, or about climate. It is a scientific divide, a technological divide. The Global South, and especially the least developed countries, have fewer SnT resources with which to manage their challenges and improve their conditions. Really, we may say that these countries do not have the knowledge required for empowerment. And so poverty and energy insecurity, lack of climate resilience are all dimensions of knowledge gap. If we look closely, we will see this knowledge gap as a very important factor in today's global conflict, the great majority of which are actually happening in the South. The questions that confront us and drive our work are stark. Which way will we go? How fast can we go? Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I'm optimistic. I believe in the power of science and technology to make significant contribution to the betterment of humanity and the well-being of Earth, especially if we have organizations such as CTBTO and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, or the International Atomic Energy, IAEA, and others acting as watchdogs for us. In 2015, the world leaders agreed to 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, each with its own set of ambitious targets. Achieving the target of the SDGs rely on a common denominator, the input of science and technology. This is why closing the knowledge gap and closing the science gap must be a focus of our effort. The World Academy of Science to us was founded more than 35 years ago in Trieste, Italy, which at the time was just a few kilometers from the Iron Curtain. It was the brainchild of a Pakistani physicist, Abdus Salam, who had won Nobel Prize in 1979, and Paolo Budinich, a physicist from Italy. The merger of two cultures. Salam eloquently described the importance of science in the developing world, and he said, with man's recent mastery of science and technology, there is no physical reason left for the existence of hunger and want for any part of the human race. And so this was a South-North partnership that sought to develop science for human well-being, science for peace. But while we had made historic progress in the ensuing years, the gap remains. Scientific production and access to scientific benefit remains far from equitable. Many nations in Africa have fewer than 100 PhD per million. This is against a level of more than 1,000 or per million population in most OECD countries. Africa accounts for only 0.8% of global R&D expenditure and only 2.4% of global research publications, and most of those are concentrated in South Africa and Egypt. But for countries to benefit from ST, they must also develop their own indigenous capacity in research, in science education, in PhD-level scientists, in well-equipped modern laboratories, and in regional and international networks. Otherwise, how can governments get the best scientific advice to help them to address issues in their own specific environment? Well, Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, at the World Academy of Science TWAS, we are helping low and middle-income countries with particular focus on least developed countries and others that are acutely lagging in science and technology. We sustained funding from the Swedish International Development Corporation. TWAS has provided more than 2,500 grants for research, amounting to 17 million in the last couple of years. And TWAS currently offers 450 PhD and postdoctoral fellowships per year. Indeed, we recently passed a historic milestone. With the support of many allies worldwide, we now have more than 1,000 early career women and men from the developing world pursuing PhD in top laboratories in our partner countries, Brazil, China, India, Malaysia, South Africa, and others. With these students return home, and nearly all of them do, their training and newly acquired expertise directly and substantially increases the scientific capacity of their country. In this way, they can help their countries to move closer toward their SDG targets. But it is one thing to improve the science system within a country. It is another for countries such as our own, Rwanda, for example, my own, to have a voice on the international stage in organizations such as CTBTO and others. While we struggle to achieve sufficient scientific capacity, we struggle to contribute to international discussions and ensure that our interests are heard. To help this need, AAAS and TWAS science diplomacy program in several years have provided several training for science diplomacy for scientists for more than 50 countries in the developing world. And a growing network of allies now is interested in working with us, such as OPCW, the Islamic Development Bank, partners in India, Egypt, Europe, and the United States. And so you see why I am optimist. Dear colleague, people in growing numbers everywhere are committed to science for peace. Achieving our goals requires strong commitment and our best energy sustained over many years. By joining in a common mission, we can help to ensure that the result of our work truly contribute to a world in which people and many nations' culture can live together in prosperity and in harmony with the earth. On the behalf of the TWAS Council and our global membership, I offer congratulations to Dr. Zerbo and to the entire CTBTO for the work that you are doing. We all have so much to learn from you, and I'm confident that during this conference, we will hear much that can inform and inspire our work to address the urgent challenges that define our moment in history. Thank you.
Very compelling remarks there from Professor Murenzi, and ending on an optimistic note, which we very much need today. So thank you very much for that. Our next panelist is Professor Jennifer Thomson, President of the Organization for Women in Science in the Developing World. OWSD was founded in 1987, becoming the first international platform that unites women scientists from across the spectrum, including the developing world, with the objective of strengthening their role in the development process and promoting their representation in scientific and technological leadership. Professor Thomson is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of Cape Town. Throughout her career, she has won a plethora of prestigious awards and fellowships. Most recently, a human rights honor from an Italian institute, which is actually often given to human rights activists, so it's a true feat. Now, this morning, Professor Thomson will share her views on science and technology as a driver for development, particularly where the peace and security nexus is concerned, as well as her thoughts on the barriers that women are facing and girls in accessing careers in STEM disciplines. Very relevant for us in the CTBT world, and particularly significant given that this conference comes nearly 2 decades, that's 20 years after the UN Security Council called for the increased participation of women in peace and security decision-making. We will be exploring that theme. It's something that I mentioned earlier in depth tonight in the Women in Science panel. Professor Thomson, the floor is yours. Thanks again.
It's simply amazing to be here. So I really am grateful to be given this opportunity to share some of our work that we do. I'm not going to actually ask you, I was going to, but I thought I'd give you a break. You've all heard of my organization, OST, which is our acronym, but I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up because I'll wait till the end. But OST is an organization that has over 6,000 members. We have national chapters are the backbone of our organization. We stretch from China and India through the Arab countries. Africa is our biggest number of members, and through to Latin America. And we do a number of things to improve their lot as scientists. First of all, with the aid of the Swedish government, we give grants to women scientists to do PhDs in the developing world, because we think that by working in the developing world, they will stay in the developing world. So we need that, and they can be either full-time or sandwich, because, you know, by the time women in the developing world get to do their PhDs, very often they've got children. Some of them do make the sacrifice and come for 3 or 4 years to another country, but that's tough. So we have sandwich as well. Then very recently we've had grants from the Canadian government to assist early career women. You know, when women go to their first job in an academic environment, many of them actually face quite a lot of opposition because many of them have had the PhD opportunities. And so we now give them grants to help them develop their labs, to get equipment, to go to workshops, to learn how to write papers, and to really engage how to get the most out of their academic careers. But the backbone really of our organization are the national chapters, and we do expect them to be mentors and to bring these younger women into the community of scientists and to raise awareness of the importance of women scientists. So why is it important to have OST? Well, we should probably have it in the developed world as well. But if an alien arrived on this planet and looked at the people involved in science and technology, maybe that person would say, or it would say, what's with the Y chromosome in science and technology? Why do most scientists have a Y chromosome? What's wrong with 2X chromosomes? They run everything, they sort out everything, and they have a different approach to problem solving. Maybe 2X chromosomes would be a good idea to include more in science and technology. So to get back to OST, one of the first things I did when I became president about 4 years ago was to include the Y chromosomes. I said, we need men in our organization. Why, said some of the women. I said, let me give you an example. I come from South Africa. We have an academy, and we have a young academy. And the young academy has a meeting every year, and one year the subject of the meeting was women in science. And they invited me along to speak. And I looked at the audience and I said, wow, there are a lot of young men here. Have you come to meet the young women? No, they said, We don't want the women in our lives, we don't want our girlfriends and our sisters to be treated the way our mothers, our aunts, and our grandmothers were treated. So the young men want it differently. So of course, men are welcome in our organization as long as they agree with what we stand for. And they're not eligible for the PhD fellowships, of course. And the second thing I did when I became president was to include social scientists. Science doesn't occur in a vacuum. We need the science to be accepted by people in the environment. And so we need the social scientists. So we have become all-encompassing so that we have men, women, and I've now got another a category of membership, which we are calling Friends, for people from the developed world to open up opportunities for our women scientists from the developing world. So I'm now going to ask you, everybody who knows now what OST does, please raise your hands. Please raise your hands if you know what we do. Okay, well, if you don't know what we do, then please wait for the end of the panel and I'll ask you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Now, I would like to start with a Q&A segment, and I'd like to kick off actually with 3 video questions that were submitted to us by young people from the different corners of the globe, from Zimbabwe, the United Arab Emirates, and my current home country, France. Let's take a listen to the first one.
Hello, my name is Farashon Matias. I'm a journalist based in Zimbabwe, Southern Africa. I am 23. Well, my question to you, the panelists, is what measures can be put in place to ensure that young girls, particularly here in Africa, venture into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields so that they can play a role in promoting peace and security on the continent?
I'd like to put that question to Professor Thomson there, because though, of course, in your initial address, you did allude to some of the programs that you have in place, perhaps you can give us more of an insight.
Is the microphone on? Yes. Well, as I've just said, we have a program. We start at the PhD level. We don't have anything in our organization. We are dependent on funding, and we are a program of TWAS, so we fall under Professor Murenzi, and we're a program of UNESCO. So we are dependent on the funding we get. If we could get more funding, we could have more programs. But at the moment, we're dependent on CEDA and on the Canadian International Development Research Centre. So for those 2 programs, PhD and early career, those are the ones. But it is through the national chapters, and the more countries that start national chapters, the more women we can reach.
Thank you very much. Professor Murenzi, I will come back to you on this topic later because I have my own question to ask you. But for now, we're going to throw to the second video question from our youth.
Hello, I am Guillaume. I'm 28 years old and I live in France. I'm working in urban relations. Today, science and technology are challenged every day by pseudoscience affirmations. It can be in the media, online, or even in the mouth of politicians. Therefore, my question is simple. How can your international organizations help reinstate belief in science against the constant and unembarrassed scientific information we are confronted with every day?
I'm going to repeat that question. That was Guillaume from my country, France, drawing attention to the fact that today science and technology are challenged, he says, by pseudo-claims through media outlets, not France 24, on social media and even by politicians. Presumably, there is a reference there to the likes of Donald Trump himself, who I believe referred to climate change as, and I quote, a hoax. So he asks how organizations like yours, and this is a question to you, Professor Murenzi, can help reinstate belief in science.
I can say that the organization as ours, the OS and other organizations, are linked to nations. So it is important for nations to understand the importance of science and technology. We are not doing science just for science sake. It's because science is important for development. So people have to understand that. It took a long time before economists and development scientists understood how can you get long-term economic growth? Because if you don't grow economies, you cannot reduce poverty. So in 1957, Robert Solow, who's an American economist, did a breakthrough. He did a study showing that the American economy from 1909 to 1949, the bulk of the growth came from science and technological progress. Labor and capital contributed to less than around 10%. And that made a huge difference in understanding, actually, in countries investing in science and technology. So investing in science and technology becomes very important. So countries at national level should be able to have national science technology policies. That has 4 major objectives. Knowledge acquisition and deepening. What kind of science in primary education? What kind of science for the population at large? The notion of a science culture. We're talking about women in science. You cannot wake up in the morning and try to do PhDs if you didn't start in primary school. So science starts at the primary school level and goes to secondary and goes to higher education. And then you need to have, as a country, what kind of knowledge creation for you? What kind of research for you? The research for Rwanda is different for national research for Congo or from the US because history, because endowment in terms of resources, and then the notion of knowledge transfer. Science is not done just in schools. When we were learning science in school, doing equation 2x plus 1 equal to 0, people will think that that's science. They not see environment as science. They not see health as science. They not see agriculture. They not see botany as science. So science is done in agriculture, in health, and so forth. And then the whole issue of innovation, intellectual property right. How do you change? What is innovation? There is enough technology and enough knowledge for our country in the developing world to be able to develop. The US and OECD countries, they need to produce new technology to grow their economy because they have used most of the technologies. But our countries, like Rwanda and others, have not used those technologies. I can give you, close with an example that I like to give in general. Around 2000, Rwandan coffee was fetching on the market $0.5 per kilo. And then USAID and the University of Rwanda, Texas A&M, and Michigan State introduced coffee washing stations in Rwanda and the region. By washing coffee and drying it properly, the Rwandan coffee fetched $5, $10 per kilo, and is in Costco and in Starbucks, changing the paradigm for the farmers. This means existing technologies already, those technologies for the farmers of Rwanda and East Africa were new innovations, and they changed dramatically the way they do business. So it is very possible by using technology that existed already to change dramatically the economies in our countries.
Professor Murenzi, they're speaking about the importance of science, technology, and innovations, and that leads very nicely to our third and final video question.
My name is Shantyaei, and I'm from Malaysia. I'm 28 years old, and I live in Dubai. My question for you is, what does the emergence of new technologies mean for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation?
I would like Ms. Nakamitsu to take that third question.
Well, that's a really big question. In my remarks, I largely focused, for change, in fact, focused on what those new technologies can actually bring positively. There is a huge potential, huge scope for new means of verification that actually gives a lot of scope for us to, in fact, advance our objective of nuclear disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. You know, if you talk to a lot of experts, and these are not diplomats, I'm talking about military experts, for example, they say that things have become much more difficult to hide thanks to the new technologies, you know, that can actually be utilized for verification to make sure that they are, you know, that the agreements are being complied with. Now, talking about the negative, I didn't talk about negatives today in my remarks a little bit. There is, however, also a lot of concern. And I talk about, you know, quite often the issues related to the new means in cyberspace that could actually give serious concerns on the nuclear security and also nuclear arms control aspects. Just a very few examples. For example, if nuclear command and control structures were to be hacked, there is a serious concern about the stability. There is also something about deep fake that artificial intelligence can potentially create, and therefore impacting the you know, early warning mechanisms, etc. So there is a serious concerns about new technologies also threatening what we have as security and peace, international peace and security when it comes to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. I think what is really important now is to look at nuclear issues in conjunction with those science and technologies. Probably in today's modern world, nuclear stability, strategic stability is no longer sort of isolated in a nuclear field. We need to actually think about those issues in conjunction with new science and tech, including what I only mentioned, cyber and AI, but also what is going on in outer space. What are the implications of so-called hypersonics, the missiles that can fly 6 times the speed of sound, and that is really highly maneuverable. So with all these new technologies potentially be linked with the nuclear domain is the most serious concerns that we have. The good news is that a number of countries are now starting to think about those issues. A number of countries are also starting to take initiatives to start a thinking process, dialogues in these areas. So I need to actually end my remarks again with some positives so that we would not be all depressed in this field.
Thank you, Ms. Nakamitsu, for presenting the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to the world of disarmament and non-proliferation. Now, before I take questions from the floor, I want to shift the questions back to the role of women, because, of course, despite, again, to reiterate, despite what you're seeing here today, the science and technology sector does continue to be dominated by men. And I want to pose a question to Professor Thomson now. What do you think has been hampering gender equality in this field? And certainly since you started being active, how have these barriers and challenges, in your opinion, evolved?
When I became head of the Department of Microbiology at the University of Cape Town, I was the first woman head of a department in the science faculty. I was interviewed, it was during the apartheid era, I was interviewed by 15 white men, most of whom didn't want me to be there, because I was breaking barriers. I mean, for instance, all the seminars were held at 6 o'clock in the afternoon when mothers were looking after kids. Important meetings were not during school hours, and I suddenly realized that the whole ethos of the university was run on the basis of we have all the time in the world, and we don't have to go and look after kids and take them to doctors or whatever it is, and so there was a whole ethos, and it's slowly breaking down. But you have to look at the problems that a woman has in running a home and running a career. And I even saw it I have two married couples in my laboratory, and it was always the woman who had to go and look after the kids. We've got to change that. We've got to change it so that the men take more responsibility, and they will enjoy it because they know that they're getting to know their families better. So it's a whole change in our attitude to the workplace, and it's only going to improve once the young men realize that they are as responsible for all the aspects of their home lives as are the women. And I can see it happening. I can see it happening in the young people around me. And that's why it's so exciting working for OST, because we are working with young women. There are older women like me who are involved, but it's the young ones that are the driving force, and it's the young ones and the young men and the young women who are going to change things. And I can already see it changing, and that's very exciting.
So you heard it here first. I expect all of you men, when you go home, to get a little bit more involved in the housework so that women can go out and start making changes. Now, I want to pose a question to Professor Murenzi as the Executive Director of the World Academy of Sciences. Tell us what your organization is doing to bridge the gender gap, because unless I'm mistaken, Professor, at the TWAS, only 13 of 45 fellows elected were women this year. That's less than 30%, and I'm pretty harsh, but by my standards, that's very low. And I say this because also in my field, women dominate journalism schools, but inside the newsrooms, it's a very different story.
Our founder, Abdul Salam, founded also OST. It was the third World Women in Science. And then because it was closer to TWAS, so OST, they thought it was good to have a name that is completely separate for the mission. But Abdul Salam actually started OST. So this means that in our constitution and gene, actually, women is very important. So this is why we are hosting also the Secretariat of OST is under TWAS. But if you look at the global level, academies of sciences, merit academies of sciences, traditionally they were men in that sense. But there is a global trend to include more and more women, and to make sure that for the election, during the election process, that things are done without compromising the quality component. So for example, at TWAS now, we had made sure that the committees are 50-50. So we have, for example, for election, we have 10 fields with 9 members for each field. So we make sure that we have at least 50% of women in that. But also the chair are very important because they make the decision. So those are very important. But over the last few years, we've been actually getting close to 50% in terms of election. We cannot change the past, we can only change the future.
Just a question for you. When it comes to the fellows, is it because less women are applying?
The fellows?
Yeah.
The fellows is by election. Yeah, so that, but what's very important, as I said, is to make sure that those who look at the dossier, you have women there, because traditionally we find that, for example, in the 90 members of the committee, probably 10 women or 10, something like that. But now, for example, with the new committee, we make sure that we have 50-50. But at the same time, we make sure that we have we are working with women to have the right incoming candidates. So we have what we call TWAS Young Affiliate. So we elect young scientists for below the age of 40, and they stay member of the Young Affiliate for 5 years. But we make sure that we have a 50-50 or more. So that we make sure, because those are the ones who will be applying to be members in the future. So that's basically, and also of course the part component related to the Women Fellowship Program that you just mentioned, that we run there with OST. And, but also being a voice for science, for women also. We are very lucky together, we are together here, but in general, sometimes she will speak at another forum, she talk about us, but also when I speak, I didn't mention really about us because I knew she was here, But in general, when I'm speaking, I have to mention the issue of women very strongly. But to us also, host also gender insight, gender in science, technology, and innovation. This is more policy-oriented and organization that we also host. So in some sense, the global trend now with all academies in the world is to make sure that women, we have more and more women. I don't remember which country, it's probably Norway, one of the countries decided that a particular year, all the elected fellows will be women. So I hope one day to us that, for example, dedicate a year where all the elected women, so that will depend, of course, of the council, but that will be a very good thing to see. For example, if 1 year they dedicate, for example, all the fellow elected will be women, to make sure that we reduce the gap.
Thank you, Professor Murenzi. Now, we've been discussing everything from technology, innovations in science and disarmament, women's role, pseudoscience. Do we have any questions on any of those topics from the floor? Put your hands up, don't be shy. We have a question here. Can we get a microphone, perhaps? Right in the front, there's a second row.
Thank you. It's a special, I'm with CTBTO. I'm a director of HR, and I have a specific question for Professor Thomson regarding the women you mentioned just before in your speech, the younger ones. If you could give us some light about what is it that they are doing different that we in our generation, and I join you in that, have done or have not done. And secondly, is there a policy to address the needs of these younger women and how to promote them, support them, develop them, retain them in the academia, but it could also be in other areas of the workplace or science or otherwise. If you could share some light, because we do have quite a lot of information about women in North America and in Europe, but from the South African perspective, if you could share what is being done differently, or is there anything being done to retain them and foster them and empower them? Thank you.
First of all, we have a creche. So we have childcare facilities. Can I answer this by telling you a story? A little while ago, in South Africa, our Minister of Science and Technology, who happens to be a woman until the last election, and she has a program of appointing chairs for research chairs so that these people who get chairs do not have to do teaching for the period of 5 years. And she noticed after a while that these chairs were going mainly to men. So she said, just like you said, that this year, and it was about 3 years ago, we're only going to have women apply. And at the end of that year, she appointed 42 chairs who were women to these SARCHI chairs, South African Research Chair Initiative. And she gave those awards at a ceremony at the University of Cape Town, where all the vice-chancellors were invited. And she tore a strip of those vice-chancellors. She said every woman should have a chair in her own right. Why did it take me, the Minister of Science and Technology, to find these women? Why didn't they get appointed as full chairs in their own rights? And the vice-chancellors didn't have an answer. So I then got together with some of these women and I said, it's all very well for you now to have a chair, but what are the issues that are preventing you from reaching your full potential? And we drew up a list of 9 things. Some of them are, if you've got a research grant, and it's for travel, use it to take a caregiver. Every conference that's sponsored by the government, because I was giving this to the Minister of Science and Technology, has to have a special facility for children and childcare. These are essential things. When you have when you're going on maternity leave, is there somebody in your lab that's running the show and sorting things out? I had a woman who came back to the lab after 3 months only on maternity leave. 2 days later, she came to me and she said, I can't do the science anymore. It's changed in 3 months. So you've got to have facilities to get people back. And there are 9 of them. I can share them with you, and we're working on them. But it's not just the minister who can enforce. These are issues that have to be taken up by the funding agencies, because it's the money that counts. So we've got to have funding agencies like we have in South Africa, the National Research Foundation that funds research. These funding agencies have to gear their funding to realize that women have a special role in society and that they've got to gear them to enable them to reach their full potential. It's a work in progress. We're not there in South Africa yet, but I'm fighting a battle and we're getting there. We're getting there, but you have to have the funding agencies behind you. Thank you.
So we're just going to continue. I'll pose this question to Ms. Nakamitsu as well, but just to let you know, we don't have much time left, and I have so many questions to ask. If I can ask the panelists to keep it a little bit more brief so we can get through them. We don't have more than 10 minutes, believe it or not. It's going by very fast. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I could say a lot of things about this. As you know, this is achieving gender parity, 50%. Gender parity at all levels is one of the most important priority agenda for the Secretary General. Now, I will only mention 2 things here. One, I think, is the importance of younger women having role models. When I started I come from Japan. When I graduated from university, I virtually had no role models. When I found one, unfortunately not in Japan, but in the United States, it became easier for me to actually picture myself actually pursuing international career. So it is very important to have a role model, younger women to really believe that it is possible. Second, organizationally, integrating gender parity in the accountability framework of managers is hugely important. I'll tell you my own example. Disarmament is, of course, traditionally really male-dominated field. With the priority agenda of the Secretary General, now all departments are closely monitored by the Secretary General's office when it comes to gender representation at all different levels. Every 6 months, recently they showed a slide at a senior managers meeting. My department scored lowest at P5, which is middle level management, lowest representation of female amongst all departments. However, in terms of a progress that is being made, we scored 3rd highest. So that's sort of a very clear monitoring of numerical targets and also integrating it in the accountability framework. My contract will be at stake if I do not achieve gender parity within a set time frame. That makes a huge difference. And when I reach out and look for qualified, competent women, I always find them. So I do not believe that there aren't any qualified. That is a myth. There are always qualified women, and we can do something about it.
So speaking of role models, we're talking about the younger generations again, and we have a question on the app. It's from Abdel Monem Khalifa, and I'm going to pose this question to Dr. Zerbo. Where is he? Can we have a microphone for Dr. Zerbo, please? The question is there a possibility of launching internship programs for school and college students in monitoring stations? I think students would love this experience.
Sanam, I think since I'm the Director of Human Resources, I could pass on the question to her.
No, Dr. Zerbo, we have you. Why don't you answer for us?
Okay, first of all, let me say that we've achieved gender parity at senior management level at the CTBT. We have 3 women directors and then 3 men directors, so that's a good start. And Nakamitsu talked about a target. I've made it as part of the performance appraisal of the directors to make sure that each one strive to achieve gender balance and gender parity in their own division. So that's something that we're trying hard. And we're doing this as well at internship level indeed. We have an internship program. And in the internship program, we started by having interns that were not paid. But if you don't pay intern, you can't get intern from the developing world. And that's something that we managed to do thanks to our state signatories. We're getting interns from the developing world now. If you come walking in the corridors of the CTBT, you'll see many young men and women, interns, who are enjoying their work and then learning more about the technologies. But not only this, we also have I don't know how this is called, high school students that are coming, the shadowing program. So they come for 2 weeks, from school at grade 8, grade 9.
At the monitoring stations as well, Dr. Zerbo, which is what Abdel Monem is asking.
No, we don't have a structure for the monitoring station, but what we could do is to have the countries that are hosting monitoring station to have an open door where we can invite young people to come and spend some time and learn more about the technology that we're dealing with to monitor nuclear tests.
Great, there we have it, Abdel Monem. This is going to happen with the CTBTO. You heard it from Dr. Zerbo's own lips.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Now, we really don't have much time left. Very briefly to you, Professor Murenzi, is this something that organizations like yours can encourage further and reach out to younger people, to civil society?
I didn't capture the question.
It's the same question about the role of youth, how you can encourage that within your organization.
Women.
That is the question. How can your organization encourage that?
If you look at the problem in terms of gender parity at the global level and you look at country level, women, when they start their scientific career, it corresponds also to the childbearing period. And that becomes a math challenge because we have the culture of the country wanting the women to take care of at the same time to do their scientific career. So it is important for countries to be able to do the right policies. For example, in Sweden, you see the possibility for a man, for example, to be able to have a leave. So he can go home, can spend 6 months, rather than having the women to spend the 6 months at home, or they can share 6 months and 6 months. So these are something that are very, very important. But in coming back to that, the whole money that goes in research, technology, education, this funding comes from the taxpayers' money. So this means that it's a human right issue to put the right policies to make sure that gender parity comes in. It's not actually a quality issue. You have what we call the scissor phenomena. You have actually, in graduating, many countries have more young women actually graduating, actually even taking the first level positions in academia. But as they go up, you have more men. As they go up in the academic ladder, you get more men at 70% or 80% of men. Because during that time of around the 30s, but things happen around the 30s, that period, women will be pushed into getting access, taking care of the children. And then you can see that happening. So if something is done during that period of the 30s, it will make a huge difference. You can see, for example, policy-wise, countries such as Rwanda that have taken, issues where you have more women in parliament.
This is more about young people, Professor Murenzi. I know you're very keen on getting women on the platform.
Yes,
but how do you get younger people involved?
Yes.
Very briefly.
What do you say?
Younger people, the youth, it's more about their involvement. How do you bring them and how do you make them more interested in your organization? In one sentence, if you can, so we can move on to the next question.
You make them more interested in the organization if they see the future. If they don't see the future in the organization, they will not do that. So if they see more of the future in the organization, if they see possibilities, as I said, possibility for position, possibility for more equality, as I just said, in the academia, in terms of in the job setting, if they see that, then they will want to do that. Other than that, they just push them more women in STEM, and then at the end of the day, when they arrive at the highest level, you see it's more men, more the deans or the professors or the things, you see that. But as I can say that this is inequality, this is a human rights issue at the center that country have to take, at the national level, country have to take that issue very seriously.
So Professor Murenzi spoke of a future. Now, speaking of a future, I want to pose a question to Ms. Nakamitsu, and I'm going to bring Dr. Zerbo again into the equation. You're not getting away with it that easily, Dr. Zerbo. I think we all are in agreement that this conference comes at a very crucial moment, at a time when I think the daily question on our lips, certainly as journalists, is, are we really on the brink of war, at a time when some major global players are very much throwing money at modernizing their military arsenals, at a time when a number of individuals in the US administration are adversaries of arms control, at a time when officials in Iran are calling for a withdrawal from the NPT. This is a question to you both. Should we right now, should we today be worried about the future of the CTBT and the NPT? And this is a question that was also posed on the website, asked by Alireza Shahabi. Sounds very Iranian to me. Hello, Alireza. And they're also asking about the future of these pacts, especially in light of the upcoming NPT review conference in 2020. Please go ahead, Ms. Nakamitsu, and then I'll throw the same question to Dr. Zerbo.
Okay. In fact, I just came from my bilateral meeting with the future president of the review conference of the NPT that would take place in 2020. One thing that is very important is that while I entirely agree, and the UN has been actually saying that, things are very difficult, military spending is at highest since the Cold War, the threat of nuclear detonation is highest at the moment since the end of the Cold War. All this is true, and then we all know the reasons. But at the same time, I do not believe that the NPT, the treaty itself, is under a threat of collapsing. I think it would be a very misleading statement. And the other end of the same coin, the other side of the same coin, is that we have to absolutely make sure that 2020 review conference will be a success. And I know that it is entirely possible. And it is our collective responsibility to make sure that that will be the case. Now, this said, the world is really changing. Things are very different. Nuclear order as we know it today is no longer simply bipolar world. There is impact of those new science and technologies that we've been talking about. There are a lot of things that are being changing and evolving in many years. Let's protect them. Let's make sure that these are still intact, and use the time in front of us to reflect on what might be new things that we need to also think about, in addition to what we already have. And here's the youth comes into the picture. One of the things that we need to really understand and appreciate and accept is that diversity of perspectives, both from younger people but also women, with those diverse opinions and perspectives, we will be making better decisions. And that's why we need to involve these people, especially when it comes to new science and tech. It's the younger people who really understand. I'm not a scientist, but I'm probably too old to understand it. We need to learn from, we need to benefit from the youth perspectives. After all, it is the world that they are going to be living in. We have to also ask them how they would like to contribute. And I know, because I've been, in the recent months, I've been dealing with those people quite a lot. I know that they actually have a huge amount of wisdoms and expertise to contribute. So let's not be too pessimistic. Let's believe in our collective capacity to come up with a good solutions, good agreements, and understand and accept that it is our joint responsibility to do so.
I'm pleased that we have some balance here. I bring the pessimism from the journalistic perspective, and of course the optimism comes from the UN. Same question to Dr. Zerber. Dr. Zerber, can you provide reassurances that we will keep coming here for years to come, and we will continue to push for the ratification of the CTBT, despite the threats that the treaty is facing today?
I think there is hope because there is science. And there is science because we need verification for disarmament. You can't do disarmament verification without science. And this is why we have the series of CTBT science and technologies. And because we have science, I want to refer to what Professor Welland showed. And then I like the car, the Formula One from Lewis Hamilton that you put there. And not because I'm a Formula One fan, because I was watching the Grand Prix yesterday. But it is true, if you look at that car and you think that because of agreement and treaties like the CTBT, you can lock a car like that for 25 years and then hope to use it one day or not to use it, or to make sure that this car is usable, you know that the CTBT serves for something, that the technology that we have are indeed valid, and they will ever and ever and ever be useful for making sure that no nuclear test explosion is conducted in the search to develop nuclear weapon. And it is true we have political threat, but that's why scientists are always there to bring the truth, to tell people that science is to drive policy, and then policy is to get hope for science, from science. And our CTBT Science and Technology series are just meant for that.
Thank you, Dr. Zerber. Do we have any questions from the floor before we wrap up this Q&A session? Is that an arm? I have terrible eyesight. Yes, there's an arm in the corner. A person with an arm.
Hello, thank you. I'm Ilya Kursenko from the CTBTO youth group, standing again in Vienna after the 4 years when I've asked my first question to the UN Secretary General that opened the door to the youth group for me, and that's been an unforgettable journey over all these years. My question addresses the topic of this panel particularly, and it's undoubtable that the world is changing, though also changes science and technology itself. Taking into account how diverse are all of the backgrounds of our fellow panelists, I'd like to ask, how can the specific groups of youth, women, and other groups that are potential to experience some difficulties along their career paths in science and technology, how can they impact the changing state of science and technology?
Perhaps Professor Jennifer Thomson can respond to that question.
Well, I think you're a shining example. I mean, that's why you're here. It's because you get involved. And we are totally dependent on young people just like you and the women who have the same ideas as you to get involved. Don't sit on the sideline and let the older people make all the decisions. You get involved and you make sure that your voice is heard. So over to you.
Do you have any remarks, final remarks before I wrap up this wonderful session?
Yes. Most of the people who are, I know myself, I'm 60 years old. This means probably 20 years from now. Most people who are in the front may not be there 20 years from now, or 25 or 30, but most likely the young people who are in the room will be there. So the earth belongs to them. So the earth belongs to the youth. It is their responsibility to know that they need to acquire the right knowledge to protect the earth. And the organizations such as this one and other organizations that rely on science and technology, it is their responsibility to understand that It's not to say, what are you going to do for us? What can you do for you? Your brain. Are you really doing, if you are a biologist, are you really working hard? Are you putting really your butt on the chair and work very hard to become the best scientist you can and help your country, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, I don't know, Haiti? Are you really doing the right thing to do that? So this is something that we think is very important. The other thing is the issue of communication. How science is communicated, the importance of communication. Today, our moderator has showed that you can communicate, you don't need to be a scientist, but you can communicate sciences. Science is for the citizens. What CTBTO is doing is for the citizens. So the citizens should be able to understand, the global citizens should be able to understand what you are doing. At the beginning here, you show the four science area that you are using. So how can we communicate that? So communication is a key, the importance of science. We're not doing science for science sake. A professor in the lab used to be considered to be somebody who has a hair like this, who was like whatever. Now, you understand that science is there, is for you, is for health, for agriculture. So botany is not, when I was studying in Burundi in secondary school, they used to in botany, we used to learn trees from Belgium. Why can't you? The coffee tree is a tree. You study botany, and the coffee tree itself allows you to have export of coffee. So by doing the right science, by showing that science is real, then you can move forward. So communication of science is very important. See, this is something that we forget. We just leave it to the scientists like, no. In any organization that is doing with science, science communication should be a very important component of the issue. And that this conference is all about.
Now, I'm afraid we do have to wrap this up. I've been trying to haggle for more time, but apparently people need to eat. So I'm going to wrap up this wonderful panel, CTBT Science and Technology in a Changing World. I'd very much like to thank our panelists, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for being with us, Professor Romain Murenzi, and of course, Professor Jennifer Thomson. And thank you all for interacting with us and posing questions. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Zerber, for inviting me once again to moderate. Thank you all.